Welcome to tonight's event, everyone. Changing culture to maximize enterprise value. My name's Bruce Phillips. I'll be your host for this evening. I'm co-chair of the South Wales and West of England APM branch and also a member of the Benefits and Value Management Specific Interest Group. We're very pleased to announce that tonight is a joint effort between both APM groups, which we always try to encourage across the organisation. Just as a general reminder, the APM board has decided that there will be no physical events until at least June of this year. Hopefully, with the ongoing vaccine rollout, this will be achievable, but in the meantime, we are continuing with lunchtime and evening webinars wherever we can. There are lots of excellent resources on the APM website, including APM Learning, which is a lot of PM modules and supporting resources to help you develop your knowledge and skills. There is also the APM Hub, which is a very useful member discussion forum. On Chartered, there are also some really good Chartered documents available for those of us looking to attain CHPP. APM now has over 1,500 successful CHPP applicants to date, and there have been several webinars to assist members with preparing for CHPP. In terms of events, we've got a number of events occurring over the next few months that you might like to be aware of. On the 24th of March, we've got Procuring for Collaboration on Projects, and that's being run through the Contracts and Procurement SIG. On the 6th of April, we've got a data analytics event, which is delivered by Dr. Naira Chamberlain, Principal Consultant and Mathematician at Atkins. On the 6th of May, we've got the Project Management Challenge Competition Finals Night, which I'll be hosting. On the 18th of May, we've got Developing a Mature Risk Mindset, which will be delivered by Dr. David Hilson. On the 15th of June, we've got a virtual networking event, and that'll be all about risk. And one of our significant events this year is the South Wales and West of England branch conference from the 12th to the 14th of October, and that is about the project team of the future. Tonight's presentation will identify the major challenges faced in getting value and benefits management practices adopted, effectively applied and sustained in organisations, including the challenges of executive engagement, sustained sponsorship and stakeholder inclusion. Our speakers will emphasise the need for significant cultural and mindset change at all levels of the organisation if these practices are to be broadly adopted and effectively used to maximise enterprise value. John Thorp is an internationally recognised thought leader in the field of value and benefits management with many years of experience in the information management space. Author of The Information Paradox, John's passion revolves around helping individuals, organisations and society realise value from information technology-enabled change. David Golding is a management consultant with significant experience of working in the construction industry. David has worked as an engineer, a designer, project manager, planning manager, PMO manager, and management consultant, and has also attained some excellent academic achievements in the field of project management. David is also an APM Fellow, co-chair of the B&V SIG, and co-chair of Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire branch. So, without any further ado, it is now my great pleasure to introduce and hand over to John.
Well, it's a pleasure to be doing this today. I'm sitting in Victoria, BC, looking out at a beautiful ocean scene. The sun's actually shining, which is unusual, not supposed to be here. So I'm going to start off today just by going quickly through the agenda. I'm not going to read it. You can do that while I'm just saying a couple of things. We have three people working on this, as Bruce introduced, and I'm going to turn my camera off shortly because we might have some bandwidth issues. So you'll see me now, I think, and you'll see me when we get to question and answers. And I'm going to hand over to Hugo, who's doing the Mentimeter stuff, and I'll be back in a moment. We're doing Mentimeter to help you engage with us.
So I'm a disembodied voice off. I'm Hugo Mini, co-chair of the Benefits and Value SIG and committee member on a different branch on the Northeast of England branch. I'm running Mentimeter. We're using Mentimeter throughout this presentation, so you will see the questions changing as we go. And right now, we're asking the question, what role do you typically perform? We've had 8 answers already. It's going great shakes at nice speed. We're looking at is to find out whether you are at the sponsorship level, whether you are the specialists in one area or another within the PMO, academic research. You can see the questions yourself. Students should go into the non-project box if we have students. We typically expect about half of our audience to join Mentimeter, and we've probably got about that number now. More people may join as the evening progresses. You will always see that command at the top. Switch question. This one is a word cloud. So if you see an industry that is the same as yours, then if you type it in the same, that word will increase in size. If you type in something that is slightly different, it will appear as a separate entry. So we started off with a dominance of government. It looks like nuclear is the biggest one. No, defense is coming in there again. Government is certainly the largest. This is showing a really interesting mix, a huge scope of different industries represented in our audience. It's really quite exciting. Then for our last getting to know you question, we're just finding out the size of the organization that you work for. That's terrific. I'm going to hand back to John now, and there will be further questions coming up. Thank you very much for your input.
Okay, so now we want to just talk a little bit about the origins of value and benefits management. It's a fairly new sort of area, and we're also within APM bringing these two together in a SIG, so understanding the relationship between them. Project management, I'm just going to touch briefly on, really started as we know it around sort of the mid-50s, somewhere in the 50s in the US. Value analysis, I'll now hand over to David to talk about value analysis and value engineering and value management, and I'll come back and talk about the IT side.
Thanks, John. Yeah, so during the Second World War, Lawrence Miles developed a procedure around functional analysis, and this was later developed in 1952 into value analysis, which was then applied to the US Navy in 1954. This was then named first as value engineering. In the early 60s, value engineering entered the construction industry, and by 66, value engineering formed, association formed, and by 1972, this was developed into the Institute of Value Engineering. Back to you, John.
Okay, so the benefits management and the benefits realization piece of this came out of the IT world. It started all about the same time from 3 different sources. Cranfield University in the UK, which started introducing benefits modeling and benefits dependency networks. Gerald Bradley in the UK, who I think started before, but wrote about it in 2006. And when I was initially working for DMR Fujitsu in 1998, wrote a book called The Information Paradox, which Bruce mentioned, which introduced the benefits realization approach, and a second version of that, which came out, which built on that and introduced enterprise value management. So that all got morphed together really now to be benefits management, benefits realization, and now under the value management umbrella. So let me move on and now talk more about that. So what is value management? I mean, I think I'll go through big processes, but basically it's the linked up thinking, mindsets, and behaviors is the key word here. And below there, I'm saying it requires moving from a delivery culture, build it, and they will come to a value culture. So what is culture? I mean, culture is basically the way we do things around here. It's not very complicated, but it's very hard to change. And culture is related to common sense. We always know that common sense isn't in many cases, but common sense is about shared understanding and the mindsets that go with that understanding. So everything we're going to be talking about today in terms of the processes around value and benefits management is, I would hope to all of you, common sense. But it's not common sense to most people in organizations, because their common sense is based on a different shared understanding of how things are done around here. And simply implementing new processes isn't going to change that without those people first understanding and buying into the why of the change. Why do we need to do that? And they're being motivated and prepared for it. And that has to start at and be led from the top. Bruce mentioned in the introduction about the need to engage with business leadership. One of the challenges we have in this space is getting business leadership engaged in owning and being accountable for this. And I'll keep returning to that as we go through these slides. So value management principles, very briefly, I'm going to cover all this anyway. That investments will be managed as portfolios, both portfolios of programs and the resulting assets. They include everything that's required to achieve the value that we expect from those investments and assets. They're managed through their full economic life cycle, from initial idea to being retired. They recognize there are different categories that have to be managed different ways. We have to have key metrics, not lots of metrics, but key metrics, so we know whether things are going the way we think they should be and can change if necessary, pivot. And they need to engage all stakeholders and assign appropriate accountability for the delivery of all this stuff. So let's look at the full life cycle of an investment decision, which I sort of ran through then. So it's about investment, it's about adoption, then it's about business as usual, value creation, value sustainment, and then it's about retirement. So you have an idea, you evaluate whether it's worth moving forward. You may have an initial business case that's evaluated further, some priorities are made, a business case is put forth, it's selected, there's detailed planning, we deliver the solution, and we implement and go into the value creation, value sustainment bits. And I'm going to talk about all of these in the next little while. So let me hand back now to David to talk about the construction view of this.
Yeah, so the REBA 5 steps for the value management or VE study suggests that you've got information gathering, creative thinking, analysis, evaluation, and shortlisting, development, and presentation. Value planning develops the business case. Value engineering is used between the detailed design and the construction is for business as usual into the value analysis section. The value engineering can be used at any point during the value management process, so it doesn't necessarily have to just finish when we're doing construction. You can also do early contractor involvement, which is during the design phase. Highways England, they've got a system called road safety audits that you could class as a one benefit key benefit that you can have. You've got road safety audits, one that's done during the design phase, 2 that's at the end of design, 3 that's during end of construction, and 4 that's business as usual. And that basically dictates if you've actually built what you suggested you were going to build during your strategy phase. Back to yourself, John.
Thank you, David. Now I'm going to talk to this slide. You may think there's a typo on this slide in the heading. There isn't. It's intended. Rather than referring to P3M, I prefer to P to the power of 3M, because really the value that's received from our investments is essentially depends on how well we integrate project, program, and portfolio management. And it's really the other way around, because it's portfolio management that determines what we're going to do, and then we get on and do it. And I would say that I believe in terms of maturity, we're at about P1.5M in this space, and we can talk about that in the questions, and we have a long way to go. Quick comment about terminology. There are some people, I don't think there's much different, I think there's probably most understanding about what portfolio management is, but a lot of people, some people think the term program management is just too complicated and it's just a big project. It is quite different, and I'll explain that why when we go through it. And other people do use the term program, but it's still a bunch of projects. It doesn't cover everything that needs to be done. So I've given up on that battle, but I'm going to make a point now, making clear by what I mean when I talk about this. So project portfolios are about organizations determining what they need to do, what things they need to take on in terms of investments and assets to ensure they maximize overall value to their organization. Program management, the purpose of programs is to realize expected benefits from a group of projects that are both necessary and sufficient to deliver those benefits. And projects are determined with delivering the individual necessary capabilities that are required. So we're dealing with capabilities, with benefits, and with value on these three. Now, it may not be the terminology you use, but those three things are different and need to be managed differently, and it's important to understand that. So let's talk about portfolio management. As Peter Drucker said, there's nothing worse than doing that which we should not be doing at all. So portfolio management is about evaluating, selecting what we're going to do, monitoring and ongoing adjustment of what we're doing in terms of both programs and assets. There are different categories of those programs and assets which need different evaluation criteria. We assign weightings to those based on their contribution to evaluate what we should be doing, and that enables us to make good decisions on what we're doing and how to manage them and to optimize the value. Categories, it's an example of categories. They go from those categories where are mandatory with regards to keep your job if you don't follow rules and regulations, and clearly in the construction industry and in the highway industry, Dave and I've talked about, there's certain things you better do it or it just won't happen. There's maintaining basic core operations, maintaining service levels. Then there's improving things, doing things better. There's doing more things when you're growing, and then there's doing better things. And there's an increasing degree of freedom to allocate funds when you get to the top end of this, but much greater complexity of understanding what you're trying to achieve. So at the bottom end, the emphasis on minimizing cost and risk, thereby freeing up funds. But at the top end, the emphasis on maximizing value at an acceptable level of cost and risk. And then it's about running, growing, and transforming, if you put it into those words. So investments have to be selected on value. Now, what is value? Value is a function of alignment. How well is what we're trying to do align with our strategic objectives, our strategies? That always begs the question of how clear are your strategies, and we'll come to that a bit later. But to what extent is this aligning with what we want to get done? What is the business worth? What is the value, the benefits net of the cost? And what is the risk? And there's various categories of risk, and again, I'll come back to that. So portfolio management is about making an objective and consistent evaluation, having a level playing field, comparing apples to apples, and choosing the highest value investments that you can make, balancing desirability and achievability. So we're going back now. How would you describe the approach to portfolio management in your organization?
I don't know quite whether it's what we expected or not. I think it is fairly usual for different divisions to do their own portfolio management, and there are a lot of organizations which don't do any form of portfolio management. So I suppose from that point of view, it is what we'd expected. I look forward to John's comments on this as we hand back to John.
Thanks, Hugo. So I know we all love business cases. In my decades, I should date myself now, decades going around the world talking about this stuff, I always ask the audience how many people believe that their organizations have an effective business case process. And I would say that if more than 2 or 3 hands go up in the audience, and sometimes they're quite large audiences, that would be an exception. And you can read my thoughts on not my thoughts, various people's thoughts on these here, but I'll use the quote from Stephen Jenner on the right here that says, business cases are largely works of fiction based on delusional optimism and strategic misrepresentation. And for those of you who don't understand the concept of strategic representation, it's called lying in most cases. There's some way of getting the money and then they're forgotten about and we get on with the business. Unfortunately, that's really not how we should think of business cases. They really are an essential tool for ensuring that we get value out of the right investments. And that we get that value by going beyond just looking in the IT world at projects or any world at projects and understanding everything that has to be done to get value from those investments, that focus on managing the journey as well as just achieving the outcomes. Most of the benefits from an investment come after the initial investment is ended. And they ensure that there's relevant measurements, both lead and lag, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and accountability included. And basically, it has to be a living operational tool updated through the full life cycle of the decision with timely actions taken. It's an essential tool that is rarely used in that way. So how would you describe the approach to business cases in your organization?
We've gone for a slightly different format, which shows the number of answers. Now, I'm expecting up to 26, maybe 28 answers. What I'm seeing there is very much my own experience, that most people see a business case as something that goes in the drawer afterwards. It's a necessary hurdle to get money. But it's good to see that at least 2 of our respondents say that it is an essential tool and kept up to date. And at least 2 more are saying that it's retained throughout the program and signed off at the end. That's very reassuring. That's some excellent responses.
Yeah, that is indeed very encouraging. I suspect it probably comes from a construction side, but we'll see maybe in the questions and answers. I think sometimes the IT side's a bit more of the Wild West. So now let's talk about program management. What is a program? It's a structured grouping of projects that are necessary and sufficient to get the outcomes we're trying to get, to deliver the value, and so the program evolves beyond just doing capabilities to delivering outcomes, beyond focusing on just one capability or technology, to identifying all the elements of change that are required, and to focusing on managing those to deliver value. And a key tool to doing that is benefits mapping. I don't know how many of you have indulged in benefits mapping. It's a very powerful tool to be used. It's about completing and connecting the dots. And it comprises, in this case, this is what's called the results chain from DMR Fujitsu. I had a hand in developing this. There are many other tools like this out on the market. Circles on here, you'll see there are 2 colors of circles. They're outcomes, or the outcomes you're trying to achieve. The green outcomes are end outcomes or ultimate outcomes, and the pinky color, I always give up describing this color, but the reddish pinky color are intermediate outcomes. Those outcomes you need on the way to get to the end outcomes. The squares are initiatives. The blue squares are initiatives. What are you doing to do this? The arrows are how do we expect initiatives to contribute to those outcomes, or how do we expect intermediate outcomes to contribute to an end outcome? And the hexagons, or whatever they are, the 6-sided figures, are assumptions, and assumptions are things that kill you if you don't surface them. So you can see in this picture that all of these are shown here. So the benefits mapping allows you to get a clear understanding of the outcomes, the full scope of effort, and clear accountabilities assigned, as you can see by a circle here. But the value of the benefits map goes way beyond driving a pretty picture. Here's an example of a picture. It's not very pretty, perhaps, but it's run from a police force in Australia. But it's not so much the picture. The picture clearly has value. I've actually seen them be put on placemats at the end of a program when people are celebrating success. But what is most important is the process of developing them. And by that, I don't mean the tool you use, and I don't be rude to tool vendors, because they can be helpful, but they're a tool, and it's important to remember they're a tool. The KISS principle applies here. Keep it simple, stupid. Especially when you're working with the senior level. Don't put my 2 categories together there. The primary value of the benefits map is the process of extensive interviews and workshops with stakeholders. The process of developing the map with them promotes discussion, consensus, and commitment. It develops a shared understanding of the full scope of change required. And its power is in making implicit thinking explicit and surfacing hidden assumptions, and in doing so, facilitating communication and enabling better decision making. It also helps solidify the team and clarifies ownership and accountability. You need the sponsor and the key stakeholders involved here. As I said, you need to interview them all before the first working session. In large organizations, you'll often find you have to introduce them to each other in the first working session. I've often had to do that. They'll have to they have to understand that they're not just there to report back to their boss. They have to go back to their areas and communicate what we're doing to all the people in their areas and get their feedback and input and bring it back to the team, and do this on a regular basis throughout the program. It's much more than an abstract map, once used and once forgotten. When completed, it can become a living model of the benefits realization process. Living in the sense that it can and should be continually revised to monitor and communicate progress and to reflect changes over time. And it'll be interesting to hear in the Q&As if anyone has any comments on benefits mapping, because to me, it's fundamentally important. And at this stage, I just want to talk about an example where it wasn't used and the results. Those of you, well, you're all in the UK, so you probably remember the infamous UK's National Programme for Health in IT. That program originated in the early 2000s. It came out of a 10-minute conversation between the then Prime Minister Tony Blair and Bill Gates. It was initiated in somewhere around 2003 and 4 when the contracts were issued with a 3-year timeline and a budget of £20 billion. It was intended to fundamentally reform the delivery of healthcare in the NHS. It was disbanded in 2011 with an actual costs of around £20 billion. While there were some deliverables, it was basically considered, it's actually been described as the biggest IT project failure in history. And the UK there's you may know about a public accounts committee that reviews such like this. There's a wonderful video of it for this, which I have. And it surfaced in that meeting, the clinician engagement. In other words, the people who actually had to do all this stuff were not engaged until 5 years into the program. That's 2 years after it was supposed to be finished. And all the conversations that were had within the program were on the technology, not the outcomes. The senior responsible officer, when in the meeting, couldn't even articulate how much time he spent on governing the program. There was little outcome benefits discussion. In fact, and they failed to produce any benefit statements. And at 10 years after they started, they said, we were thinking about how to measure and report the benefits. They do no impact of impact changes, mostly deletions. That's what happens if you don't have this thinking up front. This helps you understand all those questions that were not answered in that program. Would it have saved it? I have no idea, but it certainly would have helped. Out of that comes a benefits realization plan. That the benefits realization plan includes the outcomes you're trying to achieve, and the outcomes should be identified in meaningful terms. You wouldn't have seen that in the slide I just showed because they didn't do that, but it's called MEDIC. So you say the outcome of this is we are maintaining something, we are eliminating something, we are decreasing something, we're increasing something, or we're creating something. There's a definition of the metric, the baseline for the metric, where the source of the metric is, what's the target over time, and who's accountable for it. And the progress against plan is managed against that register. And here's a rather gruesome example, but you can see how it's used. You can look at it at your leisure later, but it has all those things covered in here. This was a healthcare-related imaging. It's about imaging within healthcare. So how would you describe now, another question, how would you describe the approach to program management in your organization?
So we've had a few early answers, and what we're seeing is a pattern very much as we expect, which is that they are not as centrally coordinated as they might be. On the other hand, I know that there's a number of respondents from nuclear and from defence and from government where there's a drive across government to drive through better program management and to convert a lot of the project managers to working more consistently across programs and to working more consistently towards delivering benefits. I think we can hand back to John now.
Okay, and I think that's very positive that it is. I think I don't want to suggest that it's easier, but I think it is when you're building something that you don't have a chance to fiddle with afterwards very much. You have to get a lot of this stuff more right than in what is somewhat the Wild West world of information technology, where you can keep tweaking it. But getting ahead of the curve in this business, managing the journey requires what we call full life cycle governance, which I talked about before. You've got to develop complete and comprehensive value plans, hopefully to prevent things going wrong. When things do go wrong, which they will, you have to better sense and respond early and react decisively, such that you eliminate the risk of getting to the end when you have to recover or throw away and start again. And as Fred Brooks, one of the fathers of project management, says, how does a project get to be a year behind, one day at a time? You have to manage, you have to understand, and that's where these lead and lag indicators come, and I'll come back to it. You have to understand very quickly when you're going off course and take action to remedy it. And the number of executives I've spoken to, I say, well, you know, you're a bit off course on this large program. We'll say, well, I'm hoping it'll get back on course. Well, hope is not a method. You have to be actively managing this. To do that, what helps is stage gates, and I think David mentioned the term throw or whatever it was for building. Or, I can't read my slide here. You put up these stage gates during the business. You plan them during the business case. You add a change as required as you're going along. It's not a waterfall approach. You can go back and forward. You can tweak, and so quite often you're using it to progressive commitment of resources. There's more rigor as you get near because you're getting further into it, and you can make informed, timely decisions based on this. So now, having stumbled over what happens in construction, I'll hand back to David to tell you correctly what happens.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, Hours England developed the SCAR stages that you can see on the bottom there for an SCAR 1 to 7. Network Rail did the grid stages 1 to 8. If you look at the SCAR 1 to 0, this brings the visibility of what will become the final start of design during stage 3, which is the preliminary design, and then the final design accepted during stage SCAR 5. Construction works for 6 and 7's business as usual, and the benefits and value to 3P. During all phases of these stage gates, investment decision committees are held to allow the VCR or value score to be checked against the SCARs to maintain the project is on target and achieve all value and benefits. This allows a study at any point to be stopped or adjusted before it goes any further. So you can basically got governance around which area you want to stop the project if you need to. Back to yourself, John.
Thanks, David. Okay, project management. I won't tell you much about that. I think you all know about project management. Just that it is fundamentally about delivering the necessary capabilities. There's a whole bunch of ways of doing that, but lots of methodologies. And certainly the use of project management has broadened considerably since its origins in engineering and construction, and you can see it in almost all elements of organizations and society now. And I'm not going to talk much about project management. So now let's get to what I talk about, P3M plus, or P to the power of 3M plus. You know, I was listening to our provincial chief medical officer yesterday. I think we all listen to a lot of medical people these days, who was giving her daily COVID update, which, although we are doing better than most parts of the country here on Vancouver Island, is still a bit grim. We actually have more incidences of COVID in our province than they have in the whole of Australia, and of course you and Britain are even got a worse situation. But she was talking about being able to somewhat expand our contact support bubble. And I thought of the term bubble, and it set me thinking that in many ways what we talk about here is we're living in the project bubble, and we have to reach outside that project bubble because we don't operate in isolation. We need to understand all the relationships we have with the other things that go on in the organization that are essential to manage if we're going to get success. And up until this point, I've talked about expanding that bubble to include P to the power of 3M, but it operates within a broader context if we're actually going to get enterprise value. And some of this context is covered by a lot of the APM SIGs, and we need organizations to work to understand this broader context better. So on this slide and another one later, I'm going to expand the bubble. And whilst I'm doing this in some sequence, that's only for the purpose of presentation flow. I'm not presenting virtually. I usually do this on a whiteboard or doodle it on a whiteboard or on a flip chart. And I'm just showing it. I'm just doing it this way because I don't want to put up the full picture and freak you out at the beginning. So, but all of this, when we get to the end, actually has to be done at the same time. So let's start with asset management. You know, investments. The programs result in assets. They have to be covered and managed as investments and through that whole cycle. And we also have to, in the programs, manage a lot of change. Again, I don't know how, I think I heard procurement mentioned that there's a procurement SIG. My experience with change management, being a consultant, is we would always put a lot of change management into a proposal. We were told what a wonderful proposal we'd given because we were dealing with change management, and then procurement would come along and rip it out because they didn't need that. It was an extra. It's not an extra. If you don't do it, you've got a big problem. I'm sure you know that. Clearly, portfolio management is the link to strategy management. I'm not going to go into strategy management now, it's beyond it, but it's a key relationship. And performance management needs to go around all of that. So let's talk a little bit about some of those. Change management, I just talked about that. we have to evolve from lip service to taking it seriously. We're talking not just about changes in things or changes in systems. We're talking about culture change. We're talking about changing reward systems, how the organization is designed, how we manage stakeholders, etc. You can see the list there. And we have to take that very seriously, or it doesn't happen. It's not going to happen if we don't take it seriously. Investment management is managing that full cycle of the investment decision, from the idea through to the delivery of assets and the values from assets. It's about changing that culture from delivery to value. It's providing continuity between the investment and the assets, and maintaining focus on and creating value throughout the life cycle, using the business case as a key management tool. So let's talk about performance management. We measure a lot of things. We don't always measure the right things, and if we do measure the right things, they're lost because we measure too many things. There are 3 areas for metrics: solution delivery. Are we actually on track to deliver the solution? Service operation. Are we actually using what we produced efficiently and effectively? And benefits realization. Are the capabilities we produce being used? Are they being used in the expected way? And are we realizing the expected benefits? And I've mentioned before lead and lag metrics. You need both. When I talked in the results chain about intermediate outcomes and end outcomes, there are intermediate measures you need to know whether you're on track, and the end outcomes tells you whether you've got to the destination you were expecting to get to. So lead and lag are very important. And as Kaplan and Norton said, you can't measure what you can't describe, and Peter Drucker says you can't manage what you can't measure. So you've got to be explicit about this up front, not wait to the end, as in the case of the national health example I gave or talked about just earlier. Accountability is critical. The accountable person is the guy who is ultimately accountable for this response. There's a lot of people responsible. There's only one person accountable. The number of times I've heard an SRO say, oh yeah, I'm responsible, but I'm not accountable. Well, you are accountable. Someone has to be accountable. And until people understand that, we've got a big problem. So let's talk a bit about accountability. Oh, let's go. First of all, let me talk about Iraqi Chart. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. Iraqi stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and/or informed. So these charts are used to help people understand in the organization what they're responsible for, what they're accountable for, who needs to be informed, and who needs to be consulted. This one happens to be for evaluating and selecting programs to fund. Comes from something I developed with ISACA called the LIT framework. And I'm going to highlight 4 of the things on the top here. It references something called an information and services board. That may well be the board, that may be the board or a subset of the board or a mix of the board or executive members. They're the guys who are primarily accountable for managing the enterprise's portfolio and their existing assets such that they create and sustain value. They're the guys that are ultimately accountable. There's something called a value management office, which can help them, supports them. And the value management office is quite interesting. The value management office is doing its job. Most investment opportunities that go forward to the investment services board will be approved because the value management office has done a good job of either helping the sponsor get it right or convincing them it's not going to fly. We also have program management offices who help the program managers, and they conduct and assess themselves and provide that up to the portfolio management office, and then project management offices supporting project managers. You may just have one office doing this, maybe a P3ML or whatever, but those functions are required to make this work. And Iraqi Chart is a very useful way of getting that across to people. Accountability requires all these things on this slide here. You've got to know what the mandate is, you've got to have authority, you've got to be competent, you've got to have the resources, you've got to have lines of accountability, rights, etc. But most importantly, you've got to have acceptance of accountability. And as I said, that's not easy. It doesn't always happen well. Without that, you're going to fail. So is accountability clearly defined in your organization? Over to you.
It must be frustrating for project managers to, and in the early answers, to indicate that accountability is not clearly defined in their organizations. I'm really pleased to see that the vast bulk of people are saying that accountability is defined. Yeah, either a reasonable amount or strongly. That's quite a good result.
Thank you, Hugo. We're getting on the home stretch now. I'm pleased to see that too. It'd be interesting to see in the responses whether the accountability is clearly defined more on the construction side or the IT side, and that may not be apparent, but I suspect there would be some differences there. So now I'm going to complete the picture. I'm going to add a few more things here, and I want to stress again, as I said before, that this is not sequential. You have to do all of this stuff. So first of all, around here we need architecture management. All of these things, there's an architecture that ties all of this stuff together in organizations. That's changing. We're having going to an ecosystem environment, which is making that a little different, but we still have to know how this all fits with everything else. We have to link with operations management. How are they going to run this, and how are they making sure they continue to deliver value? We have to put governance around this, which I call value governance. We have to have governance that's focused on value around all of this. Essentially, through all of these areas here, which have to be interrelated, hence the arrows and the things in circles, we're balancing value against risk, and where value is total benefits net of total costs, and making those decisions to ensure that we're doing the right things and doing things right. And that's pretty simple. You know, we need to make sure we're doing the right things. As I said earlier, nothing is worse than doing right that which should never be done at all. And we need to be doing things right, or there's no point in doing them. So what's the problem? This is an old slide from Jack Welch, and it's the IT side. I'm an IT guy, but the principles, I'm not an IT guy, but I started there, and that's what I know a lot about. The failed promises of information age are the longest running disappointment in history. We're still seeing an incredible failure rate in terms of delivering value as we go into digital transformation. It might even get worse, as it did in the beginning of the earlier age. And why is that? Why are we having that problem? As he said, this is a problem that we should be grappling with and studying every day. So one of the problems here is, going back to this picture, is we have what I call value leakage. And 53% of that value leakage happens between strategy and between the strategy and the execution. Is the lack of clarity of what the outcomes are, don't know what we're doing, the lack of involvement of the people, the lack of involvement of explanation of what it's about. The biggest link is connecting the top end of this with what's being done. Second problem is structural linkage. That's the architecture thing. It's not consistent with everything else that is going on. And in fact, the least leakage is actually when you actually execute the stuff, assuming you've got those other two right. But we have to deal with that, and that's the problem that we have to deal with. So why does this happen? Well, there's a failure to acknowledge complexity. I've talked about that. Driven by a lot of this is driven by technology. There's no senior business ownership or accountability, and you can read this slide probably as well as I can. But I want to talk to 2 points on this. I want to talk about linkage, which is the second bullet at the top here. We need the linkage between the results and the strategy that I alluded to on the last slide, and between this investment and the other investments required, one investment and all the others required in other areas, internal or external to the organization, to realize benefit. And we failed to do that many times. We failed to understand the complexity of what we're doing. We need to understand the reach, the breadth of change and its impact, what areas of the organization and what other organizations and stakeholders be affected, and how do you manage that? A critical factor, the people, that is all too often underestimated and ignored. A large number of people with different starting points, attitudes and motivations need to be motivated and prepared to change. They need to understand who they are, why they are, and we need to understand who they are and where they are. And they need to understand why they need to change and how they'll have to change and the interventions required. And all of this takes time. We need to come up with a realistic timeframes based on these dimensions. I can tell you from now the IT world, largely speaking, but if you don't allow approximately 30% of the time, of the effort in dealing with this issue and dealing with managing the change and managing the benefits, it ain't going to happen. You're not going to get there. And just look at the sidebar over there. We talk about organizational change, but the reality is that organizations per se don't change. Change only occurs when individuals in the organizations, and increasingly now in today's days beyond their organizations, change their behavior and change the way they do things. We often say that individuals resist change, and people aren't comfortable with change, but Actually, it's more accurate to say that they resist being changed. Unless those individuals understand the why of the change, as I mentioned, has some input to it and see positive outcomes coming to the change, they will resist it. As I said just now, they have to be prepared and motivated, and that takes time we really factor in. And if you're proposing it, as I said before, as a consultant, purchasing, procurement strikes it out. As the title of the paper the slide bar comes from, winning hearts and minds, is critical here. And again, this has to start and be led from the top. The second and third bullets on this slide are key to make this happen. So second but last in my presentation question, what challenges do you see in your organizations in doing this?
So there's a couple of slides. The first one I'm showing you is the one where you can put a score against. You slide your slider bar to say how much is this barrier a barrier in your organization. And if you can think about it while you look down that list, if you can think of any additional barriers to realizing benefits in your organization, that will be the next slide that I display. So I'll let you carry on with it. This is, I think, very much what we have seen. The value and benefits is not actively managed, comes up so much of the time. What you can see with this shaded area is where the answers are happening. So the value and benefits not actively managed, they're nearly all happening in 4 and 5, whereas it's a bit more spread out. 3 and 5 are limited or no understanding of organizational change required. And no, that isn't a typo, that's the way it lays text out on the screen sometimes. But we are seeing all of these are scoring quite high. I'm going to give you a couple more moments before I switch to the next slide to get a few more answers on this. Then I will switch over, and if you can think what barriers you have, then that will be terrific. I'll be able to make the switch in just a moment. You're getting all the excitement of Mentimeter. So here's an opportunity to actually say in text, what barriers to program success do you have in your organization?
Okay, well, I'll wait a second, but we're pretty well at time, so.
I think the top right one, no program portfolio journey project management, is very, very common. That's the thing that we're trying to change. Yes, by all means, switch back. I think we've seen some examples and people can carry on putting answers on.
And we can come back to talk about it afterwards too. So. Okay, only 2 more slides. Peter Drucker, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You know, as I said, I tried to say at the beginning and throughout this, value and benefits management are not just a set of processes and tools, they're behaviors that need to be embedded in all management domains in the picture I showed you. Now, if we're going to get value and benefits from our investments and assets, they need to be actively managed throughout the whole life cycle. And this requires an approach to governance, and governance starts at the top. And it needs a strong focus on ownership and accountability. We need to understand, in fact, what constitutes value for an organization. I've never ceased to be amazed by how many organizations don't have clarity of that. And who's clearly the roles and responsibilities, the Iraqi Chart. And do they have effective process? Are you using them around value management and active benefits and change management? And do you have the right metrics? And the next step, we thought it was difficult now, and I guess when you're in construction pubs, it's not as challenging because they're long projects and it takes a long time, whereas IT tends to be slightly different. But with technology now and the digital world being integrated into almost everything we're doing, we're going to see a culture growing that is obsessed with value and reducing complexity. One, we're going to be challenging all aspects of the status quo, and we're going to have to be continually unlearning and reimagining and reinventing. One that is more inclusive, open, transparent, and collaborative, more open-minded, and more agile. One that's comfortable with risk, uncertainty, and continuous change. We're going to have to change how we do this. We haven't managed to do it as effectively as we could in the more traditional world, and the digital world is going to put much more pressure on us to get this right. We'll have to do the same things that I've talked about here, but we have to do them in a much more agile and collaborative and transparent way. And that's my last slide. So I'm going to hand you back, I think, to Hugo for a couple more slides, and then we'll open this up and we'll be talking to questions. and hopefully answers.
Got a lot of really useful answers on what barriers to program success do you have. What kinds of advice or support would you find most useful for helping you through this morass of benefits management? You've got choices, you can click on choices. This helps us to prepare more helpful and useful information for you. And then as my last question will be another text question, will be what have you learned and what will you do differently as a result of this webinar? That's always very valuable for people to see what other people have learned as well, because that may trigger something off in yourself. What we'll do with that slide is we'll leave that slide up while John's answering questions so that you can continue to add to it and so that you can pick out some of the points made. So what have you learned? What will you do differently as a result of this webinar? Bruce, do you have questions?
Hi, Hugo. Yeah. Okay, we have a number of questions. Okay, let's kick off. We have a slightly disappointed comment from David, who was referring, I think, John, to a comment on NPFIT, plenty of benefits mapping at the lower levels. David was saying he was part of that way back as far as 2004. Have you got any additional sort of commentary you might want to add to that?
Well, there was plenty done at the lower levels, but it certainly wasn't done. It certainly wasn't. It wasn't done, and I don't think it was done. If you didn't involve the clinicians in the first 5 years, I have a real question of how that could have been effective. And I'm relying this on two things. One, we had a team. I wasn't with Fujitsu, but they were there, and I was aware of it. We had a team there who were there to do that and didn't do it. They may have got to it later when they got into debt, but also that from the public accounts committee thing, there was the stuff that there was no clear understanding of the outcomes they wanted. So if they'd been doing benefits mapping at the appropriate level, that would have been there. So that's what my comments are based on. They're based on a number of articles and some intelligence. So there may have been amount of activity later at lower levels, but it was never dealt with at the top level. I think that's probably why there are some benefits that came out of that in individual areas and in specific areas, but the overall thing just was managed very poorly.
Okay, John, thank you. The next question, orphan projects not associated to a program are something that we are looking at to test out at relative small scale, new, high risk, high reward research delivery. Do you have any suggestions or approaches to managing benefit and value in this scenario?
Well, I think when you're in the research phase and there's potentially high benefit, you can take a lighter approach to it because you are in a fairly experimental area. But if they then become clear that this is something that would appear to have value, then you do have to get a little more into detail. I don't want to infer that this is a huge bureaucratic process. It shouldn't be, and it shouldn't, and it can't be. But I think the thinking needs to be applied to most things you do, but it can be applied more lightly when you're still very much in an exploratory stage than when you're getting into stuff you're planning to implement. But the basic understanding of, even in research, what are we trying to achieve and how might this help is valid, but I think it would be a much lighter touch. If that makes sense. I can't see, so I can't see if someone's nodding or shaking their head. So.
Okay, John. Yeah, thank you for that.
I mean, I'd say the thinking applies almost. The people I work with, we go drink. Immensely boring, I guess. But we go to the pub sometimes, and I'd say, well, I think I'm going to do this. Well, what's the value of doing that? They would say. What outcome are you trying to get? So I think it's a thinking that you have to apply. The rigor with which you apply it will depend on the context. And I think in the research context, that's quite different. But if that research is turning into something you're now going to implement, then it needs to get a little more rigorous in terms of how you're going to do it and how you know it's working well. So none of this is a tick box exercise. It's all very context specific.
Thank you, John, and hopefully, Rachel, that gives you some perspective and view for future action. We have another question from Subo. You mentioned about value leakages as strategic and structural. Could you give some examples to illustrate these leakages, please?
Well, I mean, the leakage from strategy is almost, I would say that the National Program for Health and IT, even though David says a lot of stuff was done, there was no connection. There was no clarity of outcomes for that. So there was terrible leakage in that case. That money could have been spent. There were things that were created of value, and maybe even benefits maps in certain parts created that, but it wasn't £20 billion worth of value. That was immense leakage, and people died, people suffered because, you know, that money could have been spent on better things. So it invariably happens when there isn't that connection there. In terms of the architecture stuff, it's just that we forget, we need to understand the relationship between everything that goes on in our organizations, and we start, I mentioned you had to introduce stakeholders. We quite often start doing something in one part of the business which is already being done in another part of the business a different way, and we didn't realize that, and that causes issues that we have to manage that should have been avoided at the beginning.
Okay, John, thank you. Another question, this time from a guy called Bruce.
Are you related?
This question is, most know that value and benefits are the end game. So fundamentally, why don't we do it?
Well, that's a great question. Most of us in the benefits and value management space know that. And the business leadership might say that, but that their actions don't show they understand what they have to do it. I mean, they have to own and be accountable for this, and they don't get involved. They don't get engaged. They don't own it. So it's all words. All too often it's just words at that level. We understand it, we live it, but we haven't managed to get the people who actually have to own it and be accountable for it and be involved in it throughout. Not in deadly detail, but they need to be involved in getting clarity of the outcomes, how they're going to measure and how they're going to oversee that it's going the right way and providing the necessary support to it. And it doesn't happen.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on that one, John. I've also seen, you know, formal letters from top level senior down to, you know, the relevant SRO and acceptance and handover, if you like, of those written letters formally. But ultimately, you might have a failing significant project or program where, you know, accountability has been accepted, but actually there's very little or no punishment, if that's the right word to use.
Oh yeah, I mean, quite often you redefine success and declare victory. You know, it's no, there's there isn't a lot of punishment, and I'm not saying there should be. There should always be, with accountability.
Consequences.
There are consequences. There should be consequences, positive and negative, and there aren't in most cases. It's a challenge. I mean, most of this, and the challenge, the worry is that this has been a from the responses to the last question, that those questions about what are the challenges you have, that slide is at least 10 years old. It's probably 20 years old, and we still have the same challenges. And the challenge is because we haven't got that engagement at the top of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Got another question, John. In general, what sectors appear to treat benefits and value management better than others, and can we learn directly from them?
I don't think. I mean, I don't think it's sector specific. I think it's much more individual specific. It's also culture specific, by the way. Different countries do things different ways. I think the private sector generally historically has done it better than the public sector. I think the public sector is getting better now, because the advantage, the advantage from a citizen point of view is that the public sector has to be more transparent, so they can't hide what the private sector hides. But I would say that in most sectors I've seen successes and failures. I couldn't say one sector was better than the other. I think probably in the construction space it's probably better, although, you know, when I think about the amount of money that is the overspend on battleship warships and the overspend on other things, I think probably many of the same problems occur too. But I wouldn't say one industry shines, but there are examples in industries that do better than others, and sometimes that's sustainable, and sometimes it changes when the people change.
I guess linking that to culture, John, do the Americans or do the Australians do it better than we do in the UK?
The Australia, you know, there's almost no discussion of this stuff in America, so I shouldn't say that, but certainly it's not a hotbed of benefits and value management, I can tell you that. Australians, I think Australians do it better. I think Australians do it quite well. It may be because they're a long way from everywhere else, and they have to work things out themselves. There's also a very strong value and benefits management professional group in Australia. I did a lot of work there, and we did a lot of training there. And there's a cadre of people in this space who are there to support. And I think there is more openness in Australia, certainly I think there's more openness to new ideas. They don't rely on ideas from other parts of the world. They're on their way, so they make their own. So I think they're more open to change. The UK, I can't comment on the UK. I think they're somewhere in between, probably.
Yeah.
I mean, I would say they were in between. I think Europe's probably better in some cases, because they tend to be a bit more methodical and want to do things the right way. But Europe's big, so they probably couldn't say just all of Europe.
Yeah. Sarah's just come in with a comment. Which organizations could you suggest that are exemplars for value and benefits management?
Well, it's sort of the same question, really. I mean, as I'm largely retired now, as you know, I'm 3 years off turning 80, and it is my hair, by the way. I probably can't. If I were still actively in the field, I could probably point out some that I thought were doing this well. So maybe Hugo could, maybe Hugo would have more to offer on that at the moment. I can't pick of any that I worked with that I would say were exemplars. I think they have got further, but sometimes they go backwards. I mean, there's one organization I work with who embraced this. They were then bought by another organization who tossed it out. And now they're working their way back to getting it. So at least I would say that organization is still doing it. It's stuck. And that was in an engineering type organization.
Yeah.
So I think it's often individual divisions within organizations.
Yeah.
Rather than, so Transport for London is probably the best exemplar out there of people doing it well. People doing it systematically is defense, and yet you see so many examples where, in spite of it having been done systematically, the results aren't always what you'd like to see. NHS Digital, for example, does a lot of benefits management and does it reasonably consistently, but the rest of NHS doesn't really believe in projects and mostly relies on the skills of extremely dedicated doctors. So it's difficult to pick people out and say who's doing it well. It's easier to pick out who's doing it badly, and I really wouldn't like to do that because that would all certainly be subject to various legal suits.
Yeah, it'd take too long anyway. But I think, going back to the culture word, I think it unfortunately very few organizations have one culture. You know, so certain parts of the organizations have different cultures, but those cultures are largely come down to an individual, and it's quite often a collection. It's quite often a combination of an external individual and internal individual who make this stuff happen. So it still hasn't become part of the culture in many organizations. It's become part of the culture, as Hugo said, in some parts of the organizations, and sometimes it sticks and sometimes it doesn't.
Okay, thank you, John and Hugo. Hopefully, Sarah, that gives you a bit of direction as well.
I don't want anyone to give up, by the way. I mean,
No.
it's been a long haul, and but we are making progress, and this, we can't give up, because I mean, the waste, I mean, I alluded to the health system. I mean, people died because we didn't get stuff done. I mean, people suffered. Huge amounts of money are being wasted because this isn't done well, and they need to be held to account. We need to get a more general awareness that this has to be done better, and we need to. Part of the thing, I think, is we have to flatten organizations. We've still got an industrial age sort of organizational hierarchical siloed structure that I think every time you add a level and every time you add a silo, you reduce efficiency by 10%. Probably it's the wrong number, but we need to flatten and operate across teams in organizations much more to get this to work effectively, I believe.
It's interesting, John. I just wonder what benefits were signed off by the government when they committed to spend billions of our pounds delivering an alleged failed track and trace application.
Well, yeah, I have no idea. I suspect the benefit was probably they were seen to be doing something.
Yeah, I tend to.
I don't want to be negative. I mean, it may well be that it was very valuable, but and to be fair, I mean, things had to be done quickly, but that doesn't mean you can come up with you can very quickly come up with the outcomes and benefits you want. It doesn't have to take 6 months to do. So the discussion and the thinking still should have happened. Whether it happened or not, I certainly wouldn't put money on.
Yeah.
So the major project association examined this in December, and they examined exactly that issue, and the general consensus was amongst the panelists, I was hosting the panels, amongst the panelists was that a lot of projects were driven through with no examination of benefits. They were purely to be seen to be doing something. And being seen to be doing something in the midst of a pandemic does have its merits.
Yes. But doing something that was actually useful would have been better.
Would have been a lot better and would also have not cost so much. When you think 22 billion on track and trace in this first year is such a huge proportion of the money, it's I don't know whether it's more than the defense budget, but it's a huge amount of money that could have been better spent on something that might work. But at least we were seen to be doing something.
That's an interesting explanation there, Hugo. If I'm on reflection, I'm not surprised, but isn't that just absolutely astounding?
It should
and
be.
I think the gist of our debate was, the gist of that particular aspect of our debate was that a lot of things were pushed through the pandemic. So people have said projects have been highly successful. One of the projects put up for an award, for example, by both PMI and APM was the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. A highly successful project in project terms. It was delivered on time, very, very rapidly, very successfully. However, it cost a small fortune. It cost more than was being spent on school meals for deprived children. And it is reckoned to have created 17% of the infections with COVID. So in terms of was it successful, it was successful in the sense that it was given a specification and it delivered to that specification under hugely challenging circumstances. What about the benefits? Well, you have a very different picture when you start saying, well, you know, what were the benefits?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a cultural thing, because we should always start with what are the outcomes we're trying to achieve and what are the benefits. Not start with let's do this. And it doesn't mean you add a 6-month study to achieve that, but you need to deal with that question.
Absolutely. I'm going to move us on a little bit, guys. We have a question from Darren, who says, I see a lot of project managers confused by language to define project justification and aims, the relationship between project objectives and benefits, and other language used. What advice would you give to Prince 2 heavy public sector organisations in clearing up their use of language? Here's a nice easy one.
Well, you have to do what I do. I mean, they have to declare what they mean by it and have that commonly understood. One of the problems I find with many of the, I can't comment, I could have commented on Prince a while ago. I don't know what it looks like now, but quite often, because a lot of the definitions, the terminology they use have to be agreed to by about 3,000 people, it's very washed down. And I think you have to understand methodologies should not just be implemented as a tick box. You have to understand the intent of them and then take that and turn it into something you can use. So if the terminology is confusing, translate that into a consistent terminology you can use.
Yeah, okay. We have a question on culture, interesting one from Carl. Carl says, do you think that having one culture is essential? I have seen academics that suggest one culture in a large organization is not possible, and subcultures, business units with their own culture can be just as effective.
Well, I think that's true. But I think that probably, if you were to look at, it's very hard to climb inside Amazon and see what they do, but I would suggest that Amazon does have an overarching culture, but they're also a relatively flat and distributed organization. So I suspect there are subcultures within that organization. I think you might make the argument that the subculture should not be inconsistent with the overall culture, but there might be reasons for it to be. So yeah, I think, you know, it depends on the size and nature of the organization. Perhaps I don't think there has to be one absolute culture, although it makes life easier. But it needs to be understood, and it can't be counter to the overall intent of the organization unless it is totally seen as distinct and separate.
Okay, thanks, John.
That's a nice fuzzy answer, but I mean, it's a real world out there. So when you talk the way we do things around here, is very different. I think it doesn't have to be as different as it is, but there will be times when it does have to be different.
We've just had a question from Victor there. Victor says, as a prospective project manager without experience, what can I do as a student to get employment? Oh, there's a question.
Well, it's hard really to be honest about that. You can't fake it, but I mean, I think you just have to demonstrate that you're keen and you really want to learn and you really want to do this.
Yeah.
There is going against well, it's not going against what I said, but you know, there's a lot of common sense in project management. So if you can demonstrate you've got common sense, that if I were hiring, and I've had hired people like that, I would sense in a conversation if these people were keen, they were keen to learn, and they really had a high degree of common sense, you know.
Yeah, I think it's you're referring to the behavioural skills aspects of.
Yes, it's ultimately that's what fits it. I mean, APM isn't really so much the issue, but I challenge with all these people who get accreditations by taking, you know, by reading the books, learning them, and taking exams. You know, 60 out of 100 right exams. They're not. Yeah. They don't. That proves you can pass an exam. You've got to prove that you can actually look beyond that to actually understand and adapt and use common sense to approach this in different contexts differently.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, John. Hopefully, Victor, that gives you a little bit of direction in terms of the things that you need to sort of focus on.
And good luck. Yeah,
good luck, Victor. Emmanuel says, as a follow-on with that question, presumably the employment question, your advice is absolutely golden there, John, obviously. Most organizations don't seem to give students that opportunity if you don't have any experience. Good point.
No, I think most organizations are lazy, and if you've got accreditation after your name because you did pass the exam and get the letters, they'll hire you. You know, when I took my first job, I was a computer operator. I didn't know that, by the way. I didn't know what the job was when I took it, but they advertised for an energetic, able young man. This was an entry-level job as a computer operator. I was interviewed by three. I first of all had to take an aptitude test. You know, the things they used to do at schools. If this is this, what is that for that? And then I had three people interview me for an hour, and then I got the job. But I knew nothing about what the job was. I didn't know what a computer was. I turned up for I didn't know I was operating a computer. They didn't even ask me. So I think it's demonstrating who you are that's more important.
They were considering your behavioural skills, John. I'm sure of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also I said, I've got a job. I've already taken a job that I'd have to get rid of. So I have to know by Friday.
Yeah. And by the way, what's the salary?
And well, it was twice what I'd been offered in the other job.
Yeah.
And it started me down this road. I mean, I just loved this area.
You probably had a different perspective on value back in the day, John.
Well,
that's a different kind of value, isn't it?
Well, no, I didn't in a way, because in those days I was the computer operator, but I was also the operating system, and it was an 8K IBM 1401. So I was when the guys brought the jobs in, I would say, what are you trying to get out of this? Because sometimes they didn't work. So I had to understand what they wanted, because I could fix it. I could recognize it wasn't right, and I could run it again. And then I said, I gotta learn this stuff, so then I could actually fix it. So from my very start, I was interested in why people were using this and what they wanted to get out of it. And that's always what's driven me.
Thank you.
And curiosity.
Ram says, thanks for a superb presentation. And Subo has come in with another question. How can lessons learned play a role in maximizing enterprise value?
Well, I wish they could. You know, I mentioned the Public Accounts Committee thing that I did with out of the health thing. If you look at their reports after numerous IT failures, they all say the same thing. We don't learn. So the question isn't. The question is, how can we get people to learn from that? You know, how many? I don't think there's a government in the world who hasn't introduced a payroll system that's failed. And yet we all know what has to be done, but they don't. Somehow I'm different. You know, I think people have to realize that they're not different. They're not smarter. They have to learn from other people's mistakes and not just keep repeating them. Because if you look at the Public Accounts Committee, you see mistakes repeated over and over again. And that's just criminal.
Yeah, I think it's also lip service to some extent when it comes to lessons learned and learning from experience as well. And not great value in terms of actually taking action.
No, yeah, they don't.
No. Okay. Okay, that looks like the final question, John. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to wrap up in 2 minutes with my sort of observations, if you don't mind.
This is what I wish we had a real panel, you know, just between Hugo chipped in a bit.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe next time we can learn the lessons from this session.
Thanks to everyone who was listening. I hope they got something out of it. I enjoyed it.
So we've still got 35 odd people on the line, couple of minutes, and we'll let you go for supper. I have to say, John, thank you very much for the line, culture eats strategy for breakfast. I've used that a couple of times this week, and I think it's absolutely profound. The number of times I can recall in the last few months and in the years in the past where the word culture has been used, you know, it really has been underlined very much in recent terms. You said before, it's all about individuals. That kind of has to be the fundamental tenet for culture and changing behaviors. And you're absolutely spot on with that statement. You also explained value as a function of alignment, business worth, and risk, which I think is a brilliant description. I mean, we've seen all these mathematical equations in the past, and even a simple equation where it's perhaps benefits divided by cost. But I think your function statement there brings it to life, you know, a bit more. well, significantly more, particularly when again, your words, John, you know, there's an incredible failure rate of project delivery and implementation out there. You also mentioned the importance of leadership. For me, leadership is absolutely key. Not just at the senior levels, we can all be leaders, even at in the lowest levels of the food chain. And actually, if you step out and show that leadership, that begins to change individual and ultimately team culture as well.
Yeah, I think we have to look at leadership as a behavior, not an anointed position.
Yeah, absolutely. Where does value and benefits fit in? Well, it fits in everywhere across the whole of the life cycle. You made the point, John, about portfolio level. Clearly, that's a catch-all situation, and that's where the drive is actually emanated from. Business cases, we all know and have seen and perhaps have been involved in the production, approval, review, commentary of business cases. I know I have, and I can absolutely tell you every single time there is a level of, I mean, you used the term lying before,
Strategic misinterpretation.
Yeah, or even misrepresentation.
Yeah.
So I would actually suggest that we need to go back to our business cases individually and just have a wee think about that, because actually, who are we as project managers or project professionals to look at business cases that aren't fit for purpose and think that we can still behave knowing that from an ethical point of view, we're witnessing something and indeed have contributed to something that isn't what it's dressed up to be. So we just need to have a think about that. And then, you know, benefits mapping. Just this week, I presented a benefits map that I literally produced in about 15 minutes, right to left, left to right, and I presented it to my delivery manager, and he almost fell off his chair, literally almost fell off his chair in terms of understanding what the path to glory might actually look like. So I would suggest that, you know, if you have the time and the bandwidth and the inclination, get yourselves wrapped up in benefits mapping because it's such a powerful tool and it can answer a wide range of different questions, both from a why are we here as an organization point of view, but also from a what is it that we need to deliver those objectives from an organizational perspective. It's so powerful, and you don't have to be a deep SQEP to be able to understand benefits mapping. It's just natural thinking with boxes and lines. And then I liked your slide, John, completing the picture slide. That kind of brought it all together for me. So I thought that was very, very good, and a really good sort of indicator in terms of, you know, the organizational value and benefits and where it sits into that whole sort of change piece. John in particular, but also David, thank you very much indeed on behalf of our audience tonight. There were some absolutely excellent insights and takeaways I'm sure that we've all been able to have a little think about there and take note of. So that's absolutely really, really appreciated. Also a big thanks to Hugo for running the Menti tool. That's always a useful tool to give us an impression and understanding of who our audience actually are and what they think. And lastly, thanks to the audience for participating this evening. Really, really appreciated. Also really good to see such a wide variety of representatives from charity, government, nuclear, construction, defence and the like. Sorry if I've missed any others out, but it's good to see that particular mix. Final big thanks to John and to David. Have a good evening, everyone, and we hope to see you again very soon.